I like that concept of work is what you do, not where you go. But if that's the case, how do we define the workplace? Right? I heard someone recently say that our workplace now is 100% software. It's not, even if you go into a building, your workplace is 100% software. But it's not just a bunch of laptops. It's not a collection of technology. It's also not just a physical building. So how do we put a definition to workplace that includes that social element as well as the work we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'll go back to I don't want to, I think there's a tendency for us to all talk about what happened during the pandemic, and of course it's important, but I think it's really important that we don't forget the trends that were occurring anyway. If
Right.
you go back, 3 or 4 years ago, or even more actually, probably a decade ago. I feel old now, but almost a decade ago, we were already seeing some of the world's largest organizations try and rethink their corporate profile from a culture perspective, from a policy perspective, from a physical location perspective. Everybody at one point in the last decade wanted their corporate office to look like Google's campus. I want to go in, there needs to be free coffee, there needs to be bean bags, there needs to be dartboards, there needs to be table football, there needs to be rest areas, there needs to be highly collaborative areas, there needs to be living walls. I mean, we saw that, right, way before the pandemic. And I think that was just as a result, primarily organizations being super concerned about how to actually attract and retain talent outside of the core technology space. And in fact, there's a couple of great stories that from a big customer that we have in Australia who they went all out on building a brand new, literal state-of-the-art facility in downtown Sydney. And it was like the coolest place. I was fortunate enough to go and see it. And they built it hoping to get at least 50% occupancy because they had a flexible work model anyway. So people were able to choose, work from home, come in a couple of days, work permanently. And they created this absolutely incredible facility in downtown Sydney. And the next time I went there, they were building an identical one right next to it because it was so successful. They actually over occupied the building. So they had to go and build a brand new one next to it. So if you think about that, that was all about changing the culture. It was changing the policy and process to be more flexible. It was making the place fun. It was making the work fun. So when we think about a workplace, and we've been talking about this in Citrix for quite a few years, it's how do you have the physical workplace meet the digital workspace?
Welcome, IT changemakers, to the DEX Show with Tim Flower and Tom McGraw. Let's get into it.
Hello, changemakers. Welcome to the DEX Show. I'm Tom McGraw, joined as ever by Tim Flower, and we're very excited today to welcome Christian Reilly from Citrix. He's somebody who doesn't need too much introduction. Christian is VP for Technology Strategy at Citrix and really exerts a genuine influence on our shared space. Christian, a warm welcome to the DEX Show. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much for the invite. Pleasure to be here.
Superb. I mean, I've heard you recently define normal as a constant state of adaptation to change, Christian. I wonder if you could place, in part by way of introduction to the audience, the significant changes of the last couple of years in the context of the wider changes that you've adapted to in the course of your career.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, well, maybe I should explain the kind of the definition of the
Sure.
normal. Um, I think given what we've gone through in the last couple of years, and given the fact that, I don't think really anybody's got a stable, steady state figured out just because of literally how adaptive and reactive we've had to be and how flexible we're going to have to be going forward. I like to think of things as a new now rather than, perhaps a new normal. I think if we're aspiring to a normality that feels like it did prior to a couple of years ago, I think we're going to be pretty disappointed. Just purely because so many things have changed. And if you think about the last 2 years, even in my own sort of context, I didn't think it would have been possible for me to sit in a home office and be productive and be contributory and do great things without doing what I normally did, which was flying around the world and visiting various offices and spending time with customers and industry events and just kind of learning and picking up on vibes and doing different things. And so I think the new now, I think, reflects it a little bit better, where it puts us in a mental position to say, well, okay, now is today and now is kind of where we're currently at. But the change that we've had to adapt to and the change that we've seen, I think is going to continue to be much more something that we deal with every day. I don't think the fact that we're going to go through these huge process-based changes anymore, I just don't think they're going to happen in the way that they happened prior to the pandemic. So I think the pandemic, if anything, gave us as an industry and as a kind of a humanity an opportunity to not only reset but to actually perform what I think ended up being the world's greatest semi-coordinated remote work experiment. I think what it did, it allowed us to prove that remote work actually does work. And it even worked for me, and my career with Citrix and prior to Citrix has been predicated upon working and living in many different countries around the world, and travel has always been a constant part of the roles that I had, which of course was basically shut down for 2 years. So I think it's fascinating to see how we've adapted, but I think it's also going to be as fascinating to see how we establish a different cadence going forward for being more flexible.
Absolutely. I mean, tell us, Christian, how is Citrix adapting to what you're calling the new now, which is increasingly looking like a post-pandemic workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one advantage that we have at Citrix, and I've had for 30 odd years, is that we kind of pioneered the remote work concepts. And I don't necessarily mean that from a process perspective around the labor piece or policy in an organization. But if you think about one of the things that Citrix brought to the market was the ability to securely connect to stuff, and by stuff I mean applications, data, whatever, from different devices, different locations, really allowing people to be much more flexible by its very definition in what they considered to be work. And in fact, a few years ago, we invented a phrase at Citrix, was that work is something you do, not somewhere you go. And when you do what we do in terms of our core products and offerings and the services that we have that have been used by some of the world's biggest companies for many, many years, you kind of have to reflect that in your own culture. You can't say, well, we provide all this great technology for remote work, but everybody in a Citrix office is there 100% of the time. It just doesn't work that way. So I think from our perspective, we've had some really great leadership over the pandemic. We've kind of taken an approach of making sure we look after our employees and look after our customers. And I think one of the things that we've seen is that the hybrid work model that is fulfilled by our technology is something that we've adopted ourselves. And we actually have a program internally which we call Space to Succeed. And the idea of that was really to help drive the balance of the decision much more towards the employee, obviously taking into consideration the role that they have and taking into consideration, kind of the supervisory element. But we really opened it up deliberately to the employees to say, look, if you're comfortable with coming in the office all the time, great. If you're comfortable with never coming in the office, as long as the role supports it, that's fine. If you want to do a couple of days in the office and do whatever. And we've really seen that work very, very well, not only from the point of view of being committed to the continual well-being as we hopefully see the end of the pandemic, but just because it gives us a really good foundation for talent acquisition and retention going forward. So it's very much a case of being able to use our own technology to support that, but obviously there's a cultural aspect of that which is equally important, if not more so.
As a Christian, my enterprise IT roots go back, as much as I hate to admit it, to the late 80s, the birth of distributed computing, and was also there for the birth of some of the real early Citrix technologies, the MetaFrame and WinFrame and Presentation Server. Our first remote work programs, my former employer, were 20 years ago or more. Some may think of, as you think about hybrid work and remote work, those feel like new terms, right? But we've been doing remote work, like you said, for a long time. What are you seeing? Are you seeing the younger segment of the workforce embracing those new modes of work over the older brick and mortar? What are you seeing out in kind of the work environment?
Yeah, it's interesting, and you're right. I mean, mine go back equally far. And in the organization I was with before I joined Citrix, I was a huge customer of Citrix, and the challenges that we had when dealing with permanent, semi-permanent, and mobile, as you would call it then, but mobile being people with laptops rather than people with smartphones because they didn't exist back then, was a huge challenge for enterprise IT and continues to be so today. I think if you think about the comment around remote work, I think it's really interesting from one point of view, and in the position that we're in from Citrix, we're very privileged to interact with all sorts of different customers. And one of the things that we've seen, which is kind of a little bit of a point of clarification, I think, is that there's plenty of remote work that we see that is not work from home. And I think because we were all literally tuned for the last couple of years, for the most part, to work from home, I think we've then sort of conflated the two things. And so as a point of clarification, I always like to say, all work from home is remote work, but not all remote work is work from home. So you think about emergency responders, you think about maintenance workers, you think about delivery drivers. That's a form of remote work, but it's not work from home. So it's been interesting to see how those terms have become kind of synonymous over the pandemic, but I think they're actually different from a philosophy perspective and from a technology perspective. But if you think about the younger workforce, it's been fascinating. We have an influx of interns and graduates every year, like most technology companies, and we've onboarded a significant amount of those in the last 2 years who had not until recently never been to a Citrix office. They'd never met their colleagues face to face. They'd never been to a social event because obviously, like most organizations, we were kind of hypersensitive to making sure we stuck to the local guidelines and local ordinance where that was in place. But what we found sort of coming out of the pandemic is that the young workforce are really eager to get a social aspect back into work. Right? The things that we took for granted as we've come previous generation, where literally we would stand around the water cooler, which got kind of a bad reputation over time for being more gossip than practical and useful. But you think about just things like getting a bunch of people together for a quick meeting to whiteboard some ideas. It's not the same when you do it through two-dimensional technology staring into a screen. You don't have the same interaction. You don't have the same flow. People might not speak up on a call, but they're happy to contribute in a physical meeting. So I think what we've seen with the younger workforce, and it's the same in some of our customers. They strive more to be collaborative, and I think we've over considered the work-life balance piece to them because they're extremely hardworking people, extremely hardworking individuals. And I think this notion that, that younger workforce only wants to work for a few hours a week or, wants to continue to bring their own technology or wants to do everything that's kind of anti-establishment, it's really not true in our experience. These younger people in the workforce are desperate to learn, desperate to interact with their peers, and desperate for the social side that if they've come from colleges and universities, they've had previously, and it's kind of been cut off for a couple of years. So no, I think it's very much the case in my experience that the younger people are really keen to back in the office collaborating, maybe not permanently because they've found what works for them. And I think organizations have to know what works for each organization, but also have to take into consideration some of the suppositions that we made that may have turned out to be a little bit inaccurate.
And how does it take that into account, do you think, Christian, from a culture, career development or workplace perspective?
Yeah, the cultural aspects I think is huge. We've had a management model, supervisory model, call it what you like, in big organizations over the years that has largely been based on sort of traditional management models and presenteeism. If I can see you, it means you're being productive. I look out of my office onto a room full of people and all the people are sat in the seats, then we've got a good team doing what they're supposed to be doing. I think that model of having supervisors and middle management who are used to managing a team that's in one or maybe just two locations, but very physically, I think has been interesting from a cultural perspective. It sort of challenges the basic experience and assumptions and knowledge and processes and practicalities that we saw pre-pandemic in terms of how we thought about classic supervisory and management. But I think if you think about that from a cultural perspective, one of the tricky things I think we're going to have to navigate, and we're seeing some examples of it, is how do you create an inclusive environment? How do you really bring people together as a team if you've afforded the members of that team the choice about whether to be in a location, not in a location, sometimes in a location. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how supervisors, managers, leaders actually adapt to that and make sure that, you know, we don't bias our approach as managers and as leaders by, you know, kind of being more inclusive with the people we can see versus the people who may have made the decision that, you know, being fully remote works for me because of whatever reason. So, and that, I don't think that's just a young workforce thing. I think that's a general thing. You know, as we've reestablished the boundaries of what hybrid work looks like, I think it's going to challenge both culturally and practically the way that we include people, the way that we make teams productive, the way that we manage teams, the way that we manage expectations, and the way that we measure our results. I think will all be a little bit of a different approach than the ways we've done it in the past.
You know, your comment about remote work got me thinking our first remote worker program was 20 years ago, but we brought Citrix in even before that for the first legitimate business case, which was our remote field offices and our remote app developers that were offshore. And when you think about it from that context, the social and business interaction with those people were almost non-existent because they were remote. And we've got that same problem now with our employees and our coworkers who used to all be in the same building. Now we're all remote. That's changing over time. Hybrid work, the return to work hopefully comes back soon. But I'm curious if we can maybe explore that. The social interaction, I don't necessarily know that it damages the social elements of work, this remote piece. But what do you think the consequences are for the business side of work, as you were talking about, the work that gets done at the water cooler, the work that gets done over coffee in the cafeteria? What do you think the implications are for the business side of work, as well as the technologies? What's the implication for Citrix in this kind of return to work model?
Yeah, so from a technology perspective, I think even if you go back right to the start of the pandemic and you know, we kind of leave Citrix technology to the side for a minute, just technology in general, I think there was a real set of concerns and quite valid ones about whether, you know, people's home networks or the networks from the carriers themselves, which were seeing different traffic patterns, would be able to cope with the demand of a world where, you know, you're told to work from home and there's no choice, right? By government legislation in more than one part of the world. I think that technology held out pretty well. You know, I think about, you know, my home network was flooded. I got 3 kids who are all doing schoolwork. I've got me doing work. I've got my wife doing work. So, you know, the home network stood up pretty well. The carrier stood up pretty well. And that's just, you know, one family, right? Multiplied by literally millions of families in the UK who were kind of doing the same thing. So I think there's a fantastic story there just about the scale of technology. And of course, then you add in, you know, the famous collaborative platform providers, you know, the Zooms, the Microsoft Teams, the Ciscos, the GoToMeetings, you know, all of whom have coped admirably with increased demand and really helped set the bar for what availability and performance and reliability looks like kind of going forward. So from a Citrix perspective, you know, we kind of followed a very similar path. You know, a lot of the technology that we have is now delivered by cloud. So scaling that is a little bit easier than it is to do when you're relying on each customer to try and scale their own things, you know, as it relates to responding to being fully remote and worrying about all that technology from a remote in perspective, as opposed to being sat in the office on the LAN and on the WAN. It's a very sort of different approach. And we saw lots of customers come to us and ask for help with you know, moving to cloud or additional licenses or additional scale and figuring out how to do things smarter and quicker to support this kind of literally hard line in the sand where it was, you know, you work one way today and then the government or whoever it is or the company itself tells you work a different way tomorrow. So I think from a technology perspective, it's been fascinating, the different approach that both the technology providers and ultimately the customers themselves took around that. But I think the question about, you know, the social element is a really interesting one, and I'll maybe answer it in a slightly different way. I think pre-pandemic, we were already seeing examples of how teams were being formed, being guided, given work to do, and then disbanding in ever smaller ways. If you think about the impact of things like the gig economy, you think about contingent workforce, you think about having to find the talent where it's available and, taking the work to the talent as opposed to the other way around. I think we were already seeing a new team dynamic there anyway. I'm a big fan of the social elements of work. I think what it does above all else, it builds a camaraderie and it builds a trust, which I think is extremely difficult to do when, in reality, no matter how much time you spend on calls with people and video calls, it's really like being on, social media with a stranger until you've, sat and spoken with people in a more relaxed setting and, understood that they may have, just got married or they've just become engaged or they like to go biking or, they're a temping bowling expert, whatever. You don't get to those types of conversations. So I think building that trust and building that camaraderie, I would say absolutely has impact on the way that teams are judged in terms of productivity. I think creating fully remote teams and getting them all to rally a set of tasks is okay if that's a small, very time-based thing. But for teams and organizations that are much longer, in terms of what it is that they deliver and how they're established and what they do. I think the social element's absolutely critical. And, and as I said a little bit earlier, we've seen that in our own, with our graduates and interns in the UK, they love the social aspect of it. They love getting to know not only their peer group, which they've never met, but also, the leadership teams and the other people that are in the organization. So I think the consequence of a potential damage to the social aspect for remote work could indeed be very real. But I would temper that with the fact that as I said, we've already seen changes in the way that teams were being formed and the work was being packaged and executed, which I think is a trend that will happen anyway. The question is, is there a happy medium somewhere in there where there's a social element that still exists to the extent that it can, when teams are globally distributed. And maybe it's just once a year as opposed to once a week in the case of everybody being in the office and going for a drink or a meal on the Friday night, whatever it is. So, but I think teams work better when they're in good harmony, and I think part of the harmony building is when you really know the individuals. You kind of know them on a different level than just work, and I think it builds up a trust that really does help drive performance.
The Friday after work happy hours over Zoom just don't have the same feel as as when you leave the office and go out.
Well, they don't, but they're the only ones where you'd wear a jester's hat or a miner's lamp.
That's true. Yeah, I think we're just enabling a lot of people to drink alone at their house, because that kind of drives or what's driving the limiting factor right now on business. Now that network bandwidth costs have come down, laptop costs come down. My first laptop at the Hartford was $5,000. And it's just, you can't sustain a business if everybody has a $5,000 machine. But now that they're sub-1,000, the technology prices are coming down. But the limiting factor is no longer capacity of technology, it's capacity of people. And having the right people in the right job that aren't leaving the company to go to a better culture. It's really the people and having that workforce that drives business now.
Yeah, I mean, I there's interesting actually. You talk about the price. Almost everything in IT now is kind of consumer like, right? And
Yep.
we've seen that trend over the last decade. Be that devices or be that the models in which organizations purchase software now is the same as the subscription that I have to Spotify, right? It's a different product, but it's the same principle. It's the same model. So I think we're actually seeing consumer power or the consumer construct actually find its way into line of business more and more. Organizations are really, I wouldn't say no longer, but less likely to create these, giant single monolithic suites of applications for, a certain thing when there's just so much choice out there. And the fact is that what we've also seen, which is an interesting trend, is the user power, right? So you've got the line of business power, then we've also got the user power. So, when you bring people in from a different organization and they look at bespoke software and homegrown software in an organization and they say, well, I didn't use this at my last place. We used Salesforce or we used Workday or we used whatever. And we think about SaaS as if it's something new. I thought about this the other day when I was having a conversation about, the evolution of SaaS in our customer base. And, it's surprising, Salesforce is over 20 years old. And yet we still talk about SaaS as if it's something that, came in the last couple of years.
Right.
So, when we think about, optimizing and what do you optimize for, I think there's a couple of things that I think are really important. I think, first of all, organizations have to optimize for the user experience. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but what I mean by that is everything from before you onboard an employee right the way through the the candidate process, all the way through that is your brand on show.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to optimize for that entire candidate journey, right to the point of literally cradle to grave. And I don't mean grave in the gravest sense, but I mean we have to face the fact that not everybody's going to stay with the same company for 35 years and get a gold watch anymore. I just don't think the world is like that. But the brand being on show, optimizing for that user experience. In fact, just recently I was talking to the head of HR from a very large organization, and she said, the problem that we've got now, Christian, is that the candidates are interviewing us.
Right.
And I just thought that was the coolest phrase I've heard for a long time. Yeah. So you've got to optimize for the user experience all the way through. And then I think secondly, you have to optimize the technology, right? There's so much choice out there that we over the last, and as you said, you're as long in the tooth as I am in enterprise. But I think what we've seen is that historically we've had to put band-aid after band-aid and throw good money after bad on typical enterprise technology. I think it's so different now. It's so different. You can literally acquire a technology with your credit card, be up and running and be productive in half an hour. And that's not the same as my days of running software development in large organizations, or infrastructure in large organizations, waiting for servers to be delivered, waiting for networking equipment, waiting for people to install it, waiting for UPSs and whatever. It's like it doesn't work like that anymore. So I think optimizing for the technology is really important, and by that I mean having the processes and procedures in place to make sure that the selection of technology is the one that meets the business need, but also is flexible enough to know when to replace it rather than continue to build on it and create, the same legacy islands and problems that we've had in the past.
So, Christian, that being said, who owns this future workplace? Is it IT? Is it HR? Is it some combination of the two, or some emergent other function altogether, perhaps? The evolution of a experience management office, even?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fascinating question. If you'd asked me that 2 years ago, prior to the pandemic, I would have said that it was a joint venture between IT and HR. So there was a CHRO, CIO trying to figure out on behalf of the CEO, what does our customer journey look like? What does our internal user journey look like? What kind of personas do we have? And how do we bring the right solutions and the right environment from a technology perspective and also, kind of a business process and HR operations perspective? How do we bring all that together so that we can create what used to be called future of work, or it used to be called NWOW, new ways of working? We saw that I must have talked to hundreds of customers around the world, and that was the prevailing wind. I think what we've seen now as a result of some post-pandemic changes in business strategy and technology, and just the way that the world has kind of shifted a little bit off the axis that it was on. We've seen the emergence, as you said, chief digital officer, chief customer experience officer, chief experience officer, chief people officer. So we've seen, a new C-suite, or a number of new C-suite positions emerge where, the chief digital officer is not just about running the digital transformation strategies that may be 5 years old, but thinking about that in terms of, what does our next generation of customer interaction look like? What does our next generation of employee interaction look like, or contractor interaction? We're seeing a number of different C-suite positions come up, many of which are reporting directly into CEOs. So I think that'd be really interesting to see where that ends. I would say, as of right now, it feels like it's still pretty much in the HR IT partnership, but I think there's a ton of new potentials waiting in the wings. And as the technology gets simpler, as we can continue to leverage more and more brilliant technologies, literally like machine learning, artificial narrow intelligence, without having all of the headwind of having to learn that, because it literally is just, hey, here's a block of code, add it in and it works magic. I think we're going to see literally a ton of new opportunity there at the C-suite, which will come with some other questions, right, about chief compliance officers, chief risk officers. What do they do now? Digital risk officers.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
CISOs, all those roles, I think, because of the way that we're heading into, the next technological revolution, I think will evolve pretty rapidly in the next few years.
Fascinating stuff. Just leaves me to say that if you've enjoyed hearing Christian's thoughts on the evolving relationship between people, place, and technology, be sure to check out our DEX show, DEX Hub Mothership. You can find a link to it in the show notes. And with that, thanks so much for joining us on the DEX show today, Christian Reilly. Been a great pleasure talking to you.
Christian, thanks. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate the opportunity.
To make sure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to leave a rating of the show. Just tap the number of stars you think the podcast deserves. If you'd like to learn more about how NextThink can help you improve your digital employee experience, head over to nextthink.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.